My name is Catherine Donovan, and I'm the program manager for the Northeast Dairy Business Innovation Center. Our center is one of 4 USDA-funded regional dairy business innovation initiatives in the U.S. And our Northeast regional one is based at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets, but we do serve the dairy sector through an 11-state region, all the way from Maryland to Maine. We provide resources to the sector through direct grants to dairy businesses, through our support of dairy business viability and technical assistance resources, and through market research, such as the study that will be presented today. The Northeast Dairy Business Innovation Center a couple years ago identified a real need for small and mid-sized dairy processors who often have limited financial and staff capacity to achieve effective marketing and branding approaches to compete in the marketplace. So we sought a contractor to study consumer perceptions of brand identities to better understand strategies that businesses of this scale can use to better market their products. So this has culminated in a set of case studies of successful strategies used by regional dairy processors, as well as a marketing toolkit for Northeast dairy processors to use effectively manage their limited resources in targeted ways to reach consumers. So I will let Craig expand in depth on those things. Just a housekeeping note for everybody, if you could keep your mics muted, that would be great. And as you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat or to hold onto them until the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Craig from Good People to discuss work findings and the marketing toolkit.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you very much. I'm alternatively called Greg and Craig most of my life, so that's good. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for spending part of the afternoon here. As Catherine mentioned, we're going to present what we did over the last year in terms of looking at both the way that many dairy processors in the Northeast market their products and evaluating those. And also we looked at how consumers kind of go about purchasing dairy products and some of their perceptions and seeing where we can make a connection between the two. I'm joined today with by Elizabeth Schock, who's one of our senior researchers, and she can chime in anytime that I drop something here. And we worked intimately together on this project. So first thing is we'll just introduce ourselves. Good People Research Company is a research and advisory firm. We work with organizations on their branding, on understanding their audiences, on at the end of the day, kind of how to build their brand and how to position their brand in the marketplace. Often we tell you what you already know, but in a way we like to say that you can use it because you'll find that very often as experts in a field or very entrenched in a field, you know the field very well. Sometimes a fresh perspective can enlighten some things or highlight some things for you, and you'll instinctively hopefully be able to connect with it. So that's, from our experience, that's kind of what we do here. Again, my name is Craig Honig, and I'm joined here by Elizabeth, who can jump in at any point here. So with our understanding of what we were doing here to try to help is to learn kind of how different processors go about marketing their products, analyze that in a way that might help others learn from it. So we studied both as many different kinds of styles of marketing and branding that we could find. And we also explored, as I mentioned before, how consumers look at dairy products or purchasing dairy products. And the ultimate goal here is to try to provide something that will help small and medium-sized dairies market themselves a little bit better, or learn how to brand themselves better. So first, we just to define a couple terms so we're on the same page about things. We understand marketing as bringing your products to market. How do you bring your products to market? And that can involve a lot of things. It can involve sales. It can involve promotion, all kinds of things to get your products out in the marketplace. Branding, we understand to be the image you leave the consumer with. How do you present yourself so that in your mind, you're defined in a certain way in the consumer's mind? So we present this diagram here just to illustrate how we think about how brands exist in the marketplace. There's 4 phases of what happens. First, you have to be noticed. Then you're defined somehow by the marketplace. Are you a premium product? Are you a value product? Are you good? You're bad? That kind of thing. They usually compare it to other products in the process of doing that. And then hopefully you get your products out there so people can use them. Once they use them, they experience them. And if they like them a lot, then they will help you promote the product. And therefore your products, your brand get noticed again, kind of in a cycle here. And the key here is that you tell your story about your company, about your brand in 2 key places. One, once you've gotten noticed and the marketplace needs to define you or understand, you have some control there about what they think about you. The next time you interface with the consumer in a way that you can tell your story is once they're experiencing you. They're using your products, maybe they'll get your packaging, maybe they're talking to you about your products or your service through customer service, whatever it may be. Those are your 2 opportunities to brand yourself, to tell your story in a way that leaves the marketplace with an idea of what your brand should symbolize. So we want to understand that because that provides a structure for how we look at most of what we're doing here. So we studied the Northeast for dairy processors who market their products, and we also surveyed customers. We oversampled for the Northeast, presuming that because a lot of the dairies that we encounter market locally, that we want to understand the consumers in the Northeast in particular. So how did we do that? The first thing we did was we went up and we became consumers. We looked for dairy products. And so we looked online, we shopped, we searched, we did all kinds of ways of trying to locate a variety of different dairy products. And initially we chose 135 companies we identified that we thought that came across our radar, that we noticed, that you know, if we were searching for would come before us. We then coded those and evaluated those based on different criteria and prioritized those and reduced it down to 50 companies. We then surveyed those companies, got 24 responses. Of those 24 responses, we looked more closely at what they told us about themselves, and we selected 12 from that to do case studies on. And we've produced a case study document, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So that's the brands. Consumers, we surveyed 750 consumers, actually slightly more than that, but we cleaned the file down to about 750. And oversampled about 80+% were in the Northeast, US consumers, and just talked to them about their buying patterns, about their preferences when they look at dairy products, what they're looking for, and their perceptions of a few things that we presented to them. Out of this, we produced several work products. The case studies, as I mentioned, it's a case study document. We go over 12 different companies, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. We also created a marketing toolkit, which is a guide not just to how to, you know, design your logo or design your website, but really was more comprehensive in terms of that cycle that I showed you before. The idea that here are your sales channels, here are your promotional channels, here's how you tell your story, here's how you continue to tell your story, things like that. So we provide some resources that we could find, some guidance to how to go about this type of thing so that somebody can pick this guide up and have kind of like a plan in place to help get them started. We also produce a final report that just talks about kind of what we're talking about today, how we went about everything, and the presentation of the findings, which we're doing right now. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the key findings that we had in the surveys that we did, and not only in the surveys we did, but also all the work we kind of did in observing a lot of these companies. The first thing was the dairy company survey. And just want to let you know, just give you an idea, the respondents that we had, about 60% of them were small, identified as small, fewer than 50 in total staff. And a little greater than half had one or fewer people that could be devoted to marketing in any way. So a good portion of our respondents were smaller companies, and then we have sprinkled in some larger companies that we can learn about what they do and learn from. One of the things we asked them was, when you market your products, what do you put forward? What kind of concepts do you intentionally try to communicate? And this is important because later on, we're going to kind of compare this to what consumers are looking for. And as you can see from the chart here, you kind of have a hierarchy from, and the numbers represented on the chart there were the percentage of the respondents that said they use that intentionally. So it's a select all kind of thing. And keep in mind that this is only we reduced this purposely down to a smaller sample. So we're not trying to generalize this to all of the dairies in the Northeast. This is really just to inform you about this particular sample and kind of the priorities they told us about, so we could learn from them. So you can see here that interestingly, they focus on quality and purity, but then move fairly quickly into supporting the local community, small family farm, local farm to table, these kind of qualities that kind of characterize local small dairies. The sales channels, we asked them about sales channels. How do you go about selling your products? And you can see that most sell direct, either through retail stores, direct to restaurants. They have a store on their farm. And then a little over half use distributors. And it scales all the way down to whether you have home delivery. Very few sell through large retailers. And actually only 21% do e-commerce on someone else's site, and a little fewer than half do e-commerce on their own site, meaning they sell directly from their site. And again, this is our sample, just so you get to know it, who responded and who we were dealing with. So this is interesting. We asked them, using a scale of 1 to 10, to evaluate different aspects of their marketing. So how much thought do you put into your logo design? How much thought do you put into how you promote your company? How much thought do you put into story you tell about your company? And then we asked them how they would assess their success of their marketing. And as you can see here, that the level of success lags a little bit behind how they rate the rest of the things they do, but still relatively high in terms of they feel they're relatively successful. But when they think about it in their own minds, this is a level of effort they put into these various activities. Interesting thing, though, we attempted to see how these are correlated to one another, particularly the level of success. And what was interesting here is that the thought they put into their logo did not correlate at all with the level of success, whereas the effort they put into the story that they told, the effort they put in their how they would go about promoting their company, and very, very high and strong correlations. So there is no one way to interpret this, but what is interesting here, what it means is that when you do a correlation, it's kind of a one-to-one relationship. If one goes up, the other goes up. It doesn't mean that one causes the other, but it means that they're related in some way. And what it means is that those people who may have been very successful in their assessment of their marketing may not have at all thought they put a lot of thought into their logo, and vice versa. So it's essentially uncoupled from that. And we think that's interesting because a lot of times when people think about branding, they think about their logo, like that's our brand, but it's essentially not necessarily your brand. It represents your company, but so much else is involved, particularly in how you go about where you promote your company, how you go about it, and more importantly, the story you tell, the story you create in the consumer's mind. So we thought that was interesting to note as we go along. On a consumer survey, we wanted to find some things out. We wanted to find out where, and we took a general population, and then we kind of moved down from there because we wanted to understand of a general population, how many people tend to do what. So we just asked them where they typically buy their dairy products, what's important to them. We asked the dairy processors what they put forward when they talk about their brands. We wanted to know what was important to consumers when they look at dairy products. What words do they look for, see on dairy products? And then we look for any variations that might mean something to us. So first, just want to introduce you to this sample, to let you know who responded and kind of how it was distributed. And you can see that age-wise, it was pretty well distributed all the way from the age groupings that we gave here. About 50% were under 45 years old, 50% were over 45. 75% of respondents said that they consume dairy at least regularly. So as opposed to hardly from time to time or hardly at all. 96% have some responsibility for purchasing. So these are people who buy their own dairy. Only 4% said somebody else in my household does it. And we wanted to understand, how people, if they experience brands or they purchase brands and put them in the refrigerator and that kind of thing, how many people live with other people? And 73% of the respondents live with others. So they're either influenced by or influence others in these purchases. So this gives you an idea a little bit of the sample. We also asked them how discerning they are when they purchase dairy products. And 82% said they're at least a little discerning. And we define that as I try to find the brands I like, but it's not a big deal if I don't find what I want. You can see that pretty discerning is I'm disappointed if I don't. Very discerning is I absolutely am disappointed if I don't get what I want. And not at all discerning, I don't really care. So most of the people in the survey at least try to look for particular brands when they go shopping. It's not just a free-for-all. So this is the first kind of interesting thing that we think is 80%, and I don't know how this jives with other research that you have seen, experienced, know, that kind of thing, but reporting what our respondent says, 80% said they typically shop in a chain store. Now, they could have chosen more than one here. You can see these add up to more than 100%. But we subdivided them as we looked at different things, who shops where. So some people who shop at chain grocery stores, at least shop there, 80% of them shop there. 9% said that they shop at farmers markets, 7% direct from dairies, just to give you a concept. So already we have a kind of more prescribed audience that would be the customers, the natural customers of dairy processors in the Northeast. Some, of course, make their way into chain grocery stores, but most of the small ones will not. So we're really kind of talking about people who shop more direct or shop more local, whether it's farmers market or kind of a specialty retail store or that kind of thing. So this gives you a sense of how this population or the customer kind of pairs down from the general population. So we asked them when they look for descriptors or they look for things on products, what are they looking for? And so this represents, this was again a select all that apply. And this represents the percentage of consumers who chose each one of these things as something that's important to them when they're looking for a product. And you can see that at the top of the list, you can pay less attention to the percentages as you can to kind of the order of things. We have freshness, high quality, no antibiotics, simple ingredients, nutritious. We get down through the top 5 before we get to something taking care of our cows, goats, and sheep, where they like to see that. Then we get down to taste. And then we get down to some of the more, I don't want to say esoteric or not related directly to the taste of the product or the purity of the product kind of things. The things about the company, about the, and by the way, these terms came from the terms that dairies use when they market themselves. And you can see we had that list from before, so it's the same list. And also through our observation and study and going through all of these companies, these are the kinds of things that emerge. And so we wanted to see how many people the percentage of consumers that identified with these terms. So you can kind of see how this is laid out. Now, when we compare them, and again, we just compared them, it's kind of hard to compare, this percentage of 24 to this percentage of 750. So we just looked at the top 5 on the list in order, just to compare the consumer's point of view to the dairy's point of view. And you can kind of see that really the one thing that connects here in the top 5, at least, is highest quality and purity. So you look at the consumers, they're looking for something fresh, high quality, no antibiotics, simple ingredients, and nutritious. It's all about really things about the quality of the product itself, something that is good for them. The dairy is putting forth, the dairy processor is putting forth high quality and better tasting, which is certainly significant when you're trying to promote a product. Then they go right into their support of the local community, taking care of animals, small family farm. So one qualifier here, though, is that, and was interesting, and because we thought, well, people who are very local, people who are ensconced in the Northeast, and again, most of our respondents were in the Northeast somewhere, might value local community versus somebody who shops in a store or chain store. The thing about this was, there was no significant difference when it came to these kinds of things that consumers were looking for where they shopped. So yeah, it's possible that if we had 1 billion people in this, we might have seen some movement there or some statistical significance, but it's a pretty large sample, and there was no dramatic difference, even visually, between where you shopped for these things. So just to let you know, I wouldn't call it a disconnect, but it's something to think about in terms of what consumers are looking for and what the dairies are putting forth. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some things that we think are really interesting here that we should pay attention to. So I gave you some overview of what we found in the dairies. We gave you some overview as consumers, gave us some feedback. Now, this was very interesting that maybe not surprising, but interesting and relevant, that when we compare someone who shops at a chain grocery store to someone who shops at a farmer's market, to someone who buys direct from the dairy or gets home delivery from the dairy, you can see that you can see how the legend here is that dark red is important. And we collapse very important and important. We had a 1 to 5 scale of how important this was to you when buying a dairy product. So important, we collapsed. Very important and important. Somewhat important, we left alone. Not important is not at all important, and not very important collapsed. So you can see here when someone is buying a dairy product and they shop, the ones that come in the category of shopping at chain grocery stores, more than half of them say it's not even important. What's the story behind the dairy? The story that about the farm or the dairy. But as you get more intimate, as you gradually get more intimate with the brand itself, it becomes more and more important. You can see that once you get home delivery from a dairy, 66% of consumers said it was important or very important, the story behind the dairy that the dairy is telling, and only 22% said that it was not important, versus you can see the complete kind of flip thing with the chain grocery store. Of course, farmers market direct from the dairy, you can see how we stepped it up here, so you get more and more intimate. So the same thing is true with being local, similar pattern. Buy from chain grocery store, you're probably not as concerned about that, but you might it seemed like more people were a little bit more concerned about it. But we have the same pattern here. As you gradually get closer to the dairy itself and have more interaction with them, the more important it is that they're local. And I would think particularly for home delivery. And you can see that fewer people think it's less important. So just keep this in mind, that it's the closer you get, the more important that you know about the dairy and that you understand what the story is behind them. So now it gets even more interesting here, because what we found was we test to see if there's variations in the data make any difference. And you can see here that, and this chart may be a little confusing at first, so let me explain. And I'm going to show you this two different ways. I'm going to show you kind of a mean score, which is an average score of a 1 to 5 scale. And then I'm going to show you the actual broken out by important, not important, that kind of thing. But what this does, and I'll explain those letters also that you see there. And I hate to show you kind of a weird kind of table like this, but to me, it was the best way to illustrate this. So we asked them how important it was on a 1 to 5 scale, from not at all important, not very important, somewhat important, important, and very important, how each of these things were to you when you're buying a dairy product. So how is important is that the dairy is local? How important is it that the branding of their packaging is very professional? How important is your website branding is professional? Or how it look and feel and colors and stuff. How important is it professional? And then how important is that brand story, the story they tell about their brand? And you can see here that from ages 18 to 44, it gradually gets less and less important, but it's more important to those who are younger. Each of these things is important. When it comes to being local, you see that F up there under 25 to 34. That's probably a little bit of an aberration. But what you're doing is you've got these columns, A, B, C, D, E, F, and they just represent the different age groups. And if you see a number in one and you see all those letters, it means that score is higher to a statistically significant degree than what you see in one of the other columns. So I show you this because it's very dramatic. It shows a very clear pattern that for younger people, these things are much more important. And you can see how these letters kind of disappear a little bit, meaning that as you get older, or at least in the older age groups now, we don't know if it's going to happen if these younger people get older, but you can just see that within these age groups, it gets less and less important. Okay, that's the takeaway from this. So I show you the same thing in a different way here. And I break it out to not important, somewhat important, important, and the percentages of people that fell into those areas. And you can see here the pattern. And we mark in blue that the older age groups compared to the youngest age group you can see that they have greater representation in the not important and less representation in the important. And it's fairly dramatic, the difference in these numbers. And again, when you see these letters here, it means that there's a statistically significant difference between one column and the other. And I don't mean to get in the weeds. You can just visualize this thing and understand. If you see the yellow, by important, that means they think it's much more important than the other group. If you see the blue versus the white there, you see much less important than the others. And you can see down in the brand story, that's even the most dramatic, the most important of all of them, pretty much in the pattern, that it's much more important to younger people than the older groups. We also see, now this can account for it, something you call a confounding variable, but they may not be related at all. But younger consumers report that they shop for dairy products outside of a chain grocery at much higher rates than older people. So you have the older respondents at a very, very high rate shopping at chain grocery stores. Remember, the average was around 80%. So we got like 95%. Some of the older adults, they got families, they may have limited incomes, they have limited travel, whatever it may be, that accounts for it, but it accounts for it. And that the younger group at much higher rates than the average are shopping direct from the dairy, shopping at farmers markets. And you can see the pattern here, that the younger you are, the more you're doing. Okay. So I want to kind of encapsulate this and review what we talked about. The small Northeast dairy's primary customer is somebody who shops outside the chain stores. Not to say that they can't do both, but the primary customer is someone who's really looking for dairy outside of the chain store. Age is associated with where consumers shop. We just saw that. And just to explain for sure, so you understand, when we say it's associated, it doesn't mean that there's some causal link between something. It just means that we saw the patterns that we saw, but those can be very important. So that younger people tend to shop outside of the chain grocery stores much more than older people. Age is associated with focus on branding. So the younger you are, the more you're focused on the branding of the product. And across all the segments, as I mentioned, there was really no statistical significance of note between what people were looking for. They're all looking for quality and purity, and that resonates on your branding. So if you're going to put words on a label, this is kind of what you're going to focus on. You're going to reach a wide audience with that. And those who shop outside of chain stores place a premium on the story. And the more intimate they get with the brand, the more important that story is. Some foreshadowing for you, because we're going to talk about storytelling. So what's the theme? The theme is that authenticity sells dairy products. Good storytelling amplifies authenticity. Consumers overall are looking for quality. They're looking for purity. They're looking for freshness. They're looking for goodness, that kind of thing. That is akin to the idea of authenticity. The more authentic something is, the more pure it is. Younger people are even more focused on it. There's a lot of research out there, and cited all here. There's some Pew studies, Pew Research Center studies that have been talking about it for years, that millennials, younger generations are much more interested in brands being authentic. They take a much greater interest in what the brand does and how it treats people and what it represents value-wise than an older generation. So again, this supports this idea that authenticity is significant. So when you're a brand, the idea is that half your audience here, your under 45 audience, and we don't know, but let's presume they hold their values. I know that some life changes causes people to do things differently, but if they hold their values, that is your future. Knowing you as a brand is important. So the story you tell about your brand is extremely important. And the idea also that when you think about it, authenticity, a brand that presents itself as authentic reinforces the notion that it's going to produce an authentic product. What's an authentic product? Something that's fresh and pure. So this brings us to our case studies, and we look for these things that we just mentioned in the companies that we studied, and we selected companies we thought they're different. They're all a little different from one another, but we selected companies that we thought told their story authentically. And before we we're going to give you an example of each, but before we do that, just want to tell you, we produced this document. You're going to be able to get this document that talks about how these different companies, just reviews how these different companies tell their story. And what we determine and discern from this, and this is something we do a lot in kind of the work we do, is we listen for what the essence of these stories are. And we segment the audience based on, we differentiate companies based on the kind of story they tell. And then we try to characterize and understand what kind of story is being told. And we determined that within this group of Northeast dairies, we identified 3 different stories that are fairly clear. Now, there are hybrids of these stories, so no one falls completely in one category, but the dominant theme of these stories, the identity of these companies, come through in these 3 ways. One we call the Artisan Story, one we call the Stewards Story, and one we call the Corporate Advocate Story. And just to recall that the reason this is very important is because consumers, particularly younger consumers, are focused on the story. They want to know about the brand. They want to know who they're doing business with. They want to support something. So the clearer you can communicate and the clearer they can understand what that story is, the more significant the connection they're going to make with your brand. And remember that cycle that we talked about. When they experience your brand and they experience a story at the same time they're experiencing your brand, they're much more likely to promote you on their own. So then you have you promoting yourself and you have them promoting yourself. So the Artisan Story, we have a couple logos here. We have the logos of the ones that we feature in our case studies. The Artisan Story is one that's craft forward. We talk much more about the craft than anything else. There's and again, just to remind you, what I said before is that you can be an artisan and a steward. And we'll talk about what a steward is. You can be an artisan and a corporate if you want, but the essence of your story is what we're focused on. And the Artisan Story is one that is craft forward. It's entrepreneurial. It's usually people who take it upon themselves to make something unique and special. I mean, all the dairy products are special, but in a way that's distinctive from something else. And that's what they focus on. So the story they tell is one of authenticity and uniqueness. And they're typically small, not always, but predominantly small. And we see a lot of it in cheese production. Cheese is kind of symbolic of this kind of thing. Certainly you can do the same in any other dairy product, particularly ice cream could be done the same way. But we see a lot of cheese producers. We witness and came across mostly cheese producers that tell this kind of story, but it can be told in other areas. So the Artisan Story, an example of the Artisan Story, we selected a company called, a couple companies, but one here called Blue Ledge Farm. And the proprietors of Blue Ledge Farm are 2 artists who met studying art in Italy. They, and you've probably heard the story before, they wanted to buy land in Vermont. They bought land. And then it wasn't necessarily their original intent to make cheese, but they got inspired. And they began making cheese. And 20 years later, they've raised their family on the farm. They spent a lot of time on their website talking about their life there, relaying their life and how they interact with the land, how they interact with the animals, how their family's being raised there, how they incorporate their art into what they do. The logo was designed by Hannah, one of the proprietors, who is an artist. And it's interesting, the logo itself tells a story, and it almost tells the story of their farm in a way. And you can see how they vary it, the colors somewhat on their packaging. They spent a little money and got someone to do some aerial drone photography of their farm. It's presented very nicely. Most of the photos are about them interacting with the land, with their family. So this tells a story of artisans who are living close to the land, who are living a simple, authentic life. Okay, remember now that consumers, particularly young consumers, are searching for authenticity, searching for something real, searching for a story. They tell a story quite well on their site. The next story that's told is one that you might recognize a little bit more. It's called we call it the Stewards Story. And the Stewards Story is a story of a company that has taken upon itself to carry tradition forward. It's whether it's taking care of the land, taking care of animals, and in some cases, simply taking care of the tradition of making a dairy product. Very predominant in milk production, sometimes in ice cream production, and it's very often like a multi-generation family business. There are some instances we've seen where, entrepreneurs will take over. There's a couple examples here where entrepreneurs take over a farm and with the idea of being a steward of land conservation, of animal conservation, of bringing the tradition of local dairy delivery in some cases forward. So this is a steward story, very often family run. And one of the examples we use is Crescent Ridge, been around for 90 years in Massachusetts. They use you see this picture here of this old building. It's a dairy bar. They even have a separate site for it. That's all about bringing introducing new generations into what their grandparents experienced on their farm. They also talk about their delivery. They have delivery trucks, and they talk about the fact that people sign up and go, oh, when I was a kid, I got this milk delivered to our home, and I want that for my kids. So the Steward Story is about bringing tradition forward. It focuses on tradition. You can see here, in this instance, they have a 90-year logo that they did special. They have their old delivery truck. They feature the nostalgic barn. The logos for these companies are traditionally, we ask people about their logos, and in the case studies, you can see them talk about them, admittedly old-fashioned or traditional or wholesome, or those are the kind of words they use with respect to their logos. So that's the concept of the Steward Story. And I'm sure you can identify with many dairies that tell that story. And the last story is one we call the Corporate Advocate Story. And the Corporate Advocate Story is very interesting because you can find mixed in here new companies, entrepreneurs, established companies. But the common theme is that we call it a story of leverage for good. So you can leverage the fact that you may be a national brand and you're in all these stores across the country. You also leverage the fact that you're delivering a product that's an everyday product for somebody. They're seeing it every day. They're using it every day. So you're in a position, these companies recognize they're in a position to send a message and advocate for things. And they are also typically larger corporations. Sometimes they're startups, but they're more modern. They're carrying a message with them along with their product. So we call this the Corporate Advocate Story. And again, most dairies will have a little bit of each of these in their story or in their background or whatnot. Most of them will be stewards of some kind because they do care about the land, the animals, but we're talking about the brand. The brand is the symbol, the image. And I'm not just talking about the logo as a symbol, but the story. What do you think about? What do you relate to when you relate to this company, this particular company? So that's the Corporate Advocate Story. As an example, we use Stonyfield Organic. Not as old as some of them, but rose very quickly, grew very quickly, and leverages its position even from the beginning to promote organic food and particularly healthy lifestyle for children. and everything they do and kind of all their messaging, they're focused on kind of leveraging that position to send a message. And so that's the idea of the unique position of a dairy company being able to be in people's lives and send a message and advocate for something. So again, let's review why that's important. It's important because, and it's important to a small dairy that wants to understand how to do this, is you pay attention to telling your story at two particular points in the cycle of your brand. If you're able to get your brand noticed through promotion or advertising, or you're selling somewhere where there's a lot of people, it's very important to tell the story there and tell the right story there that you want individuals to have in their mind associated with your brand. So the marketplace will define you accordingly. You have a little bit of control there. So once they define you, hopefully they try your products. And as they're trying your products, either through your packaging, either through your communication with them, you're reinforcing that story. And then hopefully that aligns with their values, that aligns with something they want to see more of in the world, and they promote you. So with this in mind, with what I just showed you in mind, we created the Marketing and Branding Toolkit. The Marketing Branding Toolkit gives you lots of information about possible sales channels that you can use, promotional channels you can use. It gives resources that you can link to, and it tells you how to do this in context. So in context of all the other things you're doing. So you're branding, you're thinking about how you're branding and what you're branding when you choose your sales channels, when you choose your promotional channels. So it's set up that way to first define who are you, what are you trying to do? Now, based on that, here are some different things that you can follow. And so that's the way it's constructed: promotional channels, storytelling, sales and distribution channels, and building trust and rapport. We also talk about some research that we've done prior on how to build trust with customers. So we put that in the end to talk about once you have contact with people, once you're connecting with them more and more, there's a way to build a relationship with them. And then they're going to want to promote you. So that's the Marketing and Branding Toolkit, how that's set up. Okay, what does all this mean? Our conclusions, recommendations. So support organizations that are there to help small dairies. I think it's important that they recognize that there is an archetype, that the stories, the artisan, the steward, the corporate, they're different from one another, and therefore they're kind of different in what they need, and they're different in how they can tell their story. But they're all very important. Each one has a role. Each one is going to connect with a certain kind of consumer. And so the idea is to help them understand who they are, and then help them understand who their customer is, who is really connecting with that story. And so that leads into how do you tell these different stories, help them tell these stories. How do you make that part of the identity of the region, that there's these three kinds of companies, something for everyone. We're all doing something to move things along. And how do we connect people appropriately? The other thing that can happen, which we realized when we got into this research, that there doesn't seem to be really a lot of large scale research like we were doing with a large enough sample. It's hard to get to some of these companies. They're busy. They're sometimes you can't even find them. They're small. The small ones, how can we work to get a better idea, maintain better lists of these companies, of these dairies, get them to respond, understand them a little better. So a little bit more comprehensive idea of who's out there and what they're doing. For the dairies, our recommendations is that realize who your customer is and focus on that customer. And also pay attention to the fact that this younger generation, I think some dairies, I think, probably very much attuned to it. And I think we mentioned some of them. But it can be easy to kind of, especially if you've been around a long time, kind of sell to the same customer. How do you break into a new generation that's going to be your future, that's going to enable you to continue? So I think from what we've seen in the data that it's really important to understand that younger cohort of customers, and then they may be looking at something different than an older cohort of customers. And what is that? And how do you connect with that story? And also the most important thing is be who you are. So find out, discover for yourself. Are you an artisan? Are you steward? Are you a corporate advocate? And be that, and tell that story and stick to it. And don't try to be all over the place, because there is a cohort of customers for you and they're looking for authenticity. And if you stick to who you are, you're going to come across as authentic. And finally, for future research, because we're a research firm, we always talk about future research, but the idea of understanding, and for those of you not familiar with ethnographic research, it's one of our specialties, but ethnographic research is where you actually experience the world from the point of view of the people you're studying. And you try to understand the culture that's built up around that. This, particularly small dairies, farms, the Northeast, is just rich with a special kind of culture. And we know that people, remember I said, I'm going to tell you some things you already know, but people are looking for that experience. But unless they're kind of guided, unless we understand it better, exactly how it works, we may not be sure how to guide them to it properly. And we may not be able to highlight the companies that they want to interact with better. So, if we can understand exactly how that interaction works better, we can help companies understand how to target better. Also, I think it would be interesting to look at the return on investment, focusing on niche markets versus wider markets. So really, really focusing on, do you have enough customers in a very, very niche market to support you and to help you expand? And how can we demonstrate that? And how can we demonstrate that the focus will be beneficial? Because for some companies, I don't think have time to even think about it. And other companies might think, well, I'm just going to try to sell as much as I can. But the better you focus, I think the better in this kind of environment. We also think that, as we mentioned before, if there's a way to get access to a larger sample of dairy processors, we'll have a better idea what's going on and a better idea to be able to generalize some of our conclusions. And the last thing, of course, is what we mentioned was really significant, was this idea of exploring this trend, these differences in age groups. Is it simply because they're younger, so their life is different, or is it because there's generations coming up with different values? And when we talk about the younger group, we're extending that all the way to people in their mid-40s. So it's not really just some people have no responsibility, or they're just wandering around, or they don't have families yet, or that kind of thing. These are people that these generations are moving up. So is the future of dairy in the Northeast going to be defined by an understanding of these cohorts? So we recommend looking further into that. And with that, Liz, unless you have something you want to throw in there, that's my presentation. Is anybody still awake, Catherine? Oh.
Thanks, Craig. I think we can just open it up the floor. I don't see any questions in the chat. So if people want to just jump in or raise your hand, feel free to chime in. We have a question in the chat from Sarah. She's curious about the brands you chose to study and if they are financially viable.
So very good question. And obviously the ones we wanted to select should be successful by certain measures. We weren't able to get all the detailed financial information on all these companies. We did have about 8 interviews where we were able to learn a lot more about some of the companies, and they shared with us, some shared with us their production levels, and most of the ones I think that we included in are very stable companies. Some of them were hurt by the pandemic. I think everybody was probably hurt a little bit by the pandemic. So some of them are getting back to their pre-pandemic, working their way back to the pre-pandemic level. So it's a little bit hard to tell. You saw that of the ones that we surveyed, they rated themselves 7.7 on a 10-point scale of how they felt their marketing was going. So we have some indicators that most of the companies that we spoke with are certainly financially viable. Whether they're the most successful in their area or region, we don't know. Some of them definitely are very successful. I think some of the Steward companies, some of the large milk producers, deliveries felt they were doing very well. Again, most of them are trying to work their way back to the pre-pandemic levels. But we were not able to review any financials, if that answers your question.
We have another question. How would you recommend learning more about the relative value of the dairy buying consumer segments?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was suggesting in the research. And that's that kind of return on investment of focusing on certain segments and not other segments. And I don't know, we did not come across it, but I don't know what other kind of research is out there. I will say though that it's from general brand research in I don't think dairy products, since they're so ubiquitous, are that much different from many other products. We have a population, and it depends on what segments we're talking about, but if we're talking about like age segments, older consumers have more disposable income at this point until they reach to a certain point where they're on strictly fixed income. So they have more disposable income. The younger group seems to be much more adventurous. So depending on the product, I would say if it's a staple milk product, you're probably looking at families, and you're probably looking at that midsection much more. If you've got some kind of artisanal offering or some interesting kind of thing, or you're telling an interesting story, I think the value of going to a younger audience who are spending money on experience and spending money on adventure. So they don't have as much money, but they may spend more money on things like this. And I know that doesn't really satisfy your question, because I don't know. I don't, you would have to study it. In other words, you would probably have to either find or support some kind of research into that, look at that. It's a good question though. And if anybody else has a good answer, to jump in. I mean, I'll just keep talking. You can actually do a little bit of that yourself if you can segment your own customer base. So the more information you have on your customers, you can look at which customers are more valuable to you, and how you segment them is kind of up to you. Sometimes it becomes apparent. Sometimes you can artificially segment people by how far away they are, how often they buy, age, if you know it, that kind of thing. So you can actually do on your own customers, you can try to do that.
All right, we have another question. You reported on the breakdown of sales channels from the consumer perspective, and I'm wondering if you looked at the same thing from the company perspective. Was there differentiation by brand type, such as artisan, etc., or by product type?
Actually, we looked at the sales channels. We looked at the sales channels. Maybe we didn't include them there. I think, I can't remember whether we included the table there. We definitely looked at the sales channels of the companies. And in the case studies, it isn't, because it's a small sample, I wouldn't venture to say that it's representative of everyone. We can generalize it all. But when you see the case studies, we actually present all the sales channels for each of the in each of the cases. I think there's one or two cases that didn't respond to our survey, so we don't have that information. But for the rest of them, you can see, and I don't, know if there's a distinct pattern, but you can see all the sales channels and promotional channels. We also have information on whether people do certain things on their own. Do they do their website on their own? Do they do all those kinds of things? Because we wanted to evaluate these companies. So we have some information from our respondents in the processor survey of the sales channels they use. So we have that kind of breakdown across Artisan, Steward. Are they different? They're generally different because on scale. So the corporate ones can do a lot more. Although some of the small ones do a lot of things, but they probably don't do they probably do less distribution and less national selling. But when you look at the case studies, you'll be able to at least see for each of the cases how that breaks down.
Yeah, and just to clarify for everyone on here, we will be go ahead and email the resources out to you directly once we have them in hand in a few days. And then they will be posted along with this presentation on our website. So I'll make sure that everyone on this call gets access to those when they are available. It does look like we have another question. What are the top few things that farmers or processors should focus on first when making, when starting to direct market their products? What seems to have the biggest return on investment?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we did not have access enough to do, and nor to a large enough group to do an ROI study. So we don't know exactly for ourselves what gets the best ROI. We talked to some folks who did talk about, so it's more anecdotal, or I should say small sample, what they get return on. I can speak to the fact that, and I can mention some of those things. Some of those things are maintaining an email list, and everyone, just every company just about maintains a Facebook and Instagram account and gets a lot of activity. I shouldn't say everyone gets a lot of activity. Everyone maintains one. Some of these companies get significant activity by responding quickly, promptly, and constantly engaging through social media. But what we took from this is that one of the most important things is in this will be in the marketing toolkit, is to discover who you are, is like to understand what story you're telling and be very clear about it, and then begin telling it. And so that means in your website and emails you send out, no matter what your website, I mean, it's hard to know whether the prettiest websites get the most attention. It depends what people are looking and who your customer is. The most important thing is that you match, your product matches, and all of your promotional materials match who you are. So I would say one of the first things to do is get very clear on that. Then understand what kind of sales channels and promotional channels you can afford to do, or both time and money wise. And then make sure that all of that is consistent in telling a similar story. And it seems like we also covered, I don't know where you came in, Lucas, but we talked about that consumers are looking for this idea of nutrition, purity, freshness, and that this authenticity, this idea of somebody they can trust, seems to support that. So in terms of things you talk about, it would be those kind of things that the products are, pure, chemical free, because of what you do, and because it's local and it's not going through a lot of processes and not going through a lot of hands and doesn't have to reach this huge audience. It's about as pure as it can be. So I would start with that kind of story, but also depending on what you're making and how big you are and that kind of thing, and how long you've been around, tell your story very clearly.
Great. Thanks, Craig. Any last questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Craig, for joining us here. And like I said, we will have those resources out to this group who's on the call, as well as on our website over the next week or two. So please do stay tuned. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.